The session for Japan's nuclear disaster and the U.S.-Japan alliance will start shortly. Please be seated and turn off all your cell phones at this time. Thank you.
Shall we begin? Good morning. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm Senior Director of the Asia Security Program at the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., and it's a real pleasure to join the Asan Institute and all of you experts who have made this one of the most remarkable conferences I've ever participated in, focused on nuclear issues. We have in this session a focus on Japan's nuclear disaster and the U.S.-Japan alliance, which by its title tells you that nuclear issues intersect more than physics. They intersect politics and disasters. And in many ways, one could dissect this panel into at least 5 subjects. The fact that there has been a triple disaster in Japan. In fact, if you're under the age of 70 in Japan, this is the worst disaster you've probably ever experienced or remember. And the assumptions that you make about things like nuclear energy, even the peaceful use of nuclear energy, endure for such a long period of time, you have to take into account things like geography and the fact that you live on the rim of fire. It also intersects questions of obviously nuclear safety, and this is a critical issue to take out of the Fukushima disaster and the Japanese disaster, the questions of oversight and Japan's government's emergency response mechanisms, their ability to work nationally along with local government and industry, but not so close to industry that they cannot be critical. Working internationally, working with the U.S.-Japan alliance, all of these issues on nuclear safety, I'm sure our panelists will talk about. Thirdly, the question of energy security and strategy generally, with nuclear energy being at the center of this discussion, also emerge out of the Japan disaster. And we'll hear about Japan's choices that they face in terms of slowing down or just reassessing and innovating with respect to nuclear energy out of this current crisis. But in the short term, the economic impact, the impact on future nuclear exports as well, the question that the Japanese have about whether they'll continue to have the right of reprocessing or what kind of transformation that will undergo multinationally, and what to do with the spent fuel out of this disaster. Fourthly, the question of the U.S.-Japan alliance for Japan and for the United States, the impact that this crisis, this disaster has had on the alliance is direct, and again we'll hear comments on how military forces have responded, how the governments have responded in Japan, between the U.S. and Japan, and internationally. But there are a lot of potential follow-on effects on the alliance. On the one hand, strong public support for military forces, and the U.S. forces in particular have emerged out of this crisis because Japanese people saw the tangible benefits of the military actually helping in a crisis. And yet, at the same time, this is bound to be a crisis that's very costly in terms of recovery, and therefore there will be tough trade-offs to make politically and economically about where to spend money, and that will have effects on things like the sustainability of U.S. bases in Japan. And then finally, the political implications are tremendous in this disaster. Not only does Japan face a question of will it yet again have a new prime minister, but will it form a unity government? Will the recovery plan and budget pass under first Prime Minister Kan as the Japanese government and Prime Minister Kan take their last step perhaps in a high-level defense and foreign ministry meeting this month, the 2+2 process as it's called, and what they might agree to there with respect to nuclear issues but also on the alliance. Anyway, all of these issues just show the breadth of issues that can come up that transcend nuclear issues but affect nuclear power, nuclear energy, and I know we've got a great panel here to discuss them. On my left, Dr. Chaim Braun has 33 years of management and consulting experience in the electric and nuclear power industry and is a consulting professor at Stanford University. Next to him is my colleague, Zachary Hosford, who's a research associate at the Center for New American Security, most recently just having finished an amazing study with our chairman, Richard Danzig, looking at the Aum Shinrikyo experience in respect to chemical and biological weapons, but also touched on nuclear issues as well. Then Kotani Tetsuo. Tetsuo-san is a special research fellow at the Okazaki Institute. He's the 2003 winner of the Japan Defense Minister's Prize, a brilliant young comer in Japan on security issues. And then finally, retired Lieutenant General Yamaguchi Noboru. Noboru-san has been at the center of this crisis in many ways as a special advisor to the Cabinet of Japan, and it is with Noboru-san that we are going to begin this discussion. General Yamaguchi.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning. And my name is Yamaguchi, and as Patrick mentioned, I have been working for the Cabinet since this 20th of March. Almost a week after the earthquake, Prime Minister's office asked me to join them to help out the crisis management. And since then, I have been working there while teaching at National Defense Academy twice a week. So I usually spend 4 days a week in Prime Minister's office and 2 half days in the National Defense Academy teaching. And before getting started, I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for having this very timely meeting and very distinguished with distinguished scholars and specialists from all over the world. And I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for inviting me. And also, I should like to thank all the people from the world, I mean international community, offering very warm assistance after the earthquake and the tsunami and nuclear reactor accident. Actually, 159 countries, and in addition to 43 international organizations, have offered assistance to Japan, and in which Korea, one of the most generous donors in terms of the donation for the sufferers in Japan. And also, I'd like to thank very much to American friends for their help through their assistance by sending 20,000 airmen. Soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors to help out Japanese sufferers after the tsunami and the earthquake. Actually, they sent 20 ships, U.S. Navy ships, to help us, including USS Ronald Reagan, one of the newest aircraft carrier, and which showed a strong commitment of the United States to this region and as well as to the alliance. I really thank to the American friends. After having said that, I'd like to touch upon mainly 3 points, not particularly on the GOJ's official points, official positions, because you can find the official positions from the Prime Minister's Office homepage. You can find 438-page long report of earthquake, as well as a longer version of IAEA report on the nuclear reactor accident. From which you can find only 40-page long the executive summary with full of the technological jargons. It's easy reading. On the way back to your country, please bring it to get asleep. And In spite of talking about government position, I'd like to point out maybe 3 points from my military background, particularly on the military operational perspective. When I witnessed operations done, disaster relief operations done by self-defense forces with the assistance of the U.S. military forces, as well as other countries' military forces and the non-government and government organizations. Particularly, when we look at military operations to help out the sufferers in Tohoku area, the 3 things I'd like to mention. One is deployment. Second thing is how good the U.S. forces are in terms of cultural awareness. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about how we coordinated with the U.S. forces, military to military coordination. First point is deployment. It was really rapid. Self-defense forces have deployed 107,000 troops. All the airmen, sailors, and soldiers to the region within 3-4 days. Originally, there were less than 20,000 troops deployed. Deployed that area, affected area, but we concentrated. We added 80,000 within several days. That is based on the network of the camps and bases existing there. We have maybe more than 10 army bases around the suffering areas, and a couple of air and maritime defense forces, naval and air bases, including Misawa with U.S. Air Force, and the Matsushima right next to Sendai, one of the most severe suffering cities. We deployed 107,000 service people within 3 to 4 days, and all the camps and bases existing there became the hubs of logistic support for operations of self-defense forces. So one of the lessons learned is the importance of the existing bases as a logistic basis for the operations. It may apply to the other part of Japan when we need to deal with contingencies like southwestern islands. In Okinawa area, we have fewer bases. We may have to have more bases. And another point of deployment, the U.S. ways to deploy their forces. First, U.S. force started with the logistic support from the sea. USS Ronald Reagan became the base for the logistic support for Marines and airmen operating in the suffering area. Secondly, just after the earthquake, they sent a special group consisting of airmen good at recovering airbase. They were sent from Hawaii, and along with sailors, the Marines and Army soldiers, they went to the Sendai airport that was hit by tsunami. All the aircraft existing there were drawn, and all the airport facility was damaged, severely damaged. It was wrecked. And the U.S. airmen, with support of soldiers and Marines, opened up the half of runway. They removed the debris from the runway and make the 1,500 meter long. Actually, this is a half of runway of Sendai Airport, clean. And the C-130 came, landed there, avoiding the debris. And the engineering equipment came out from C-130 and cleaned up rest of the air strip within a day. On the next day, the C-17, C-141, all the cargo aircraft came to help out the suffering people, as well as supporting the Marines and soldiers supporting the suffering people. That applies to us. The technology the U.S. Air Force and Marines used was not fancy one. The C-130 engineering equipment and manpower cleaned up the airfield and established the basis for logistic support. That may apply to other area of Japan, like southwestern islands around Okinawa. If we have to deploy our troops, where it is necessary to deploy, we have to open up the logistic base, as U.S. forces showed us how we should do it. That is the first lessons. And second one is how close U.S. forces have been with the Japanese. That is one of the things we found. It's a cultural awareness. Soldiers, Marines, airmen went to, and sailors went to Tohoku area, never shook hand. They respect Japanese culture. They didn't shake hand, but rather they bowed to elderly people among the suffering areas. That was very much highly appreciated by particularly elderly people in that countryside. They are not necessarily accustomed to the foreigners and foreign cultures. So they were very much pleased to have American behaving like a Japanese. That is second thing. Third point is coordination mechanism between self-defense forces and U.S. military forces. We had liaison at the highest level. Camp Ichigaya, MOD, we had 1-star general from U.S. Forces Japan, and we sent 2-star general to camp, the Yokota Air Base, where the Admiral Walsh was placed as a headquarters of the Joint Support Force during the Operation Tomodachi. And also we had the liaison team in Camp Sendai, where our Northeastern Army became the Joint Task Force headquarters. And we had the bilateral the coordination cell in Camp Sendai, where we coordinated all the operations of Japanese and U.S. military operations. And that was, so it was not a matter of points, but rather, like this. From the top to the bottom, we had a very close coordination. I talked about Sendai Airport. There was my friend, Army Colonel headed a 30 men strong liaison team to help the U.S. Air Force and Marines and Army dealing with C-17s and C-130s flying from Yokota or Hawaii to support the activities of the military forces in that area. And finally, in that would, I hope that would become the basis for the future work. We have, in 1997, we revised the guidelines for the defense cooperation between two militaries. We promised that we were going to develop bilateral plans for various the kinds of operations, but we have done much, and particularly logistic part is the one of the part we are not doing good job. In that context, we have this time we deployed, as I mentioned, more than 100,000 SDF Japanese troops there, and along with 20,000 U.S. military personnel. That's a lot. We have experienced to supporting that big the military forces.
Thank
this
you.
time. Okay, and I hope this would become the basis for the future work for bilateral planning and bilateral defense cooperation. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, and I'm sorry to cut you short.
No,
We just,
sorry.
in the interest of time, but what General Yamaguchi, who's actually a great strategic thinker, has underscored is the practical operational capacity of both the Japan Self-Defense Forces to have this huge deployment for Japan, as well as the ability for the U.S.-Japan forces to work together in a nuclear-related crisis. Overall, he's painted a very positive picture. Obviously, there are tough analytical questions as well that could arise out of this. For instance, the fact that when you send even military forces into contaminated area, radioactive area, when Defense Minister Kitazawa insisted, he put his foot down and said, we will not allow our military men and women to face double the radiation limits. So bureaucratically, very interesting fight on how do you do that. And the U.S. response and the ability to send in expert teams who were ready for this, that's all part of the nasty business of managing a damaging nuclear crisis. Tetsuo-san, you're next, and if we can keep it brief, we'll be running back on time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me join General Yamaguchi for thanking for your tangible and intangible support for my country. And I also thank the conference organizer for organizing this very interesting conference. I will talk about the implication of Operation Tomodachi on the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I will focus on 2 points, one positive implication and one negative implication. On March 11th, when the disaster hit the northern part of Japan, I was actually in Texas, and I was watching the news on CNN, and I was impressed by the American news reports because, those reports referred to the deployment of U.S. forces around Japan, and actually the CNN reported that the carrier Ronald Reagan and the strike group was ready for any mission to support Japan. And the following day, the U.S. military started the disaster relief operations, search and rescue, delivery of food, water, clothing, blankets, and the clearance of the debris from schools, airports, and ports. But we have to admit that regarding the nuclear disaster, the communication between the two governments was not good at first, at least for the first 5 days. But the situation changed when the Mr. Goshi Hosono, who is the assistant to the Prime Minister, took charge of the nuclear disaster issues and the U.S.-Japan coordination. And after that, General Yamaguchi joined the cabinet to advise the disaster relief, and the situation dramatically changed. For example, the U.S. Marines, the Seabirth, the Chemical Biological Incident Response Force, came over to Japan, and they provided advice and assistance to the Ground Self-Defense Force, NBC unit. And I think, in this disaster, although this is a natural disaster, I think the alliance, U.S.-Japan alliance, actually worked and functioned for the first time. And I think this has a tremendous implication on the U.S.-Japan cooperation in armed conflict. And, the positive implication of this Operation Tomodachi is, first of all, it deepened the alliance cooperation. And also it raised the public awareness of the importance of the alliance itself and the importance of the presence of U.S. military in Japan. And we expect a 2+2 meeting later this month, and the 4 ministers will announce the combined U.S.-Japan military operation for nuclear disaster. So that is a positive step for the alliance. But I have to talk about the negative impact. when the disaster hit, the USS George Washington, which is forward deployed in Yokosuka, was under the regular maintenance. But after the nuclear disaster, the GW actually evacuated. And the official reason for the evacuation was, to maintain the operational capability of this GW. But, the real reason for the evacuation was, U.S. Navy didn't want link the nuclear disaster with this nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The opposition camp in Japan, who opposed to the deployment of GW, actually regarded the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier as a mobile nuclear power plant. And before the deployment of GW in Yokosuka in September 2008, those opposition camp rallied against the deployment of this mobile nuclear power plant. In the U.S.-Japan relations history, there were two nuclear issues. One was the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japan. During the Cold War, U.S. surface ships carried nuclear weapons, and actually, U.S. Navy home-ported its carrier, USS Midway, at Yokosuka, and we are almost sure this carrier carried nuclear weapons. But today, since the U.S. government announced the removal of tactical nuclear weapons from the surface ships, this introduction of nuclear weapons is not an issue anymore. But still, another nuclear issue, which is the visits by U.S. Nuclear-powered vessels to Japanese ports and waters, this is still an issue. Back in 1964, when Japan accepted the first U.S. nuclear-powered submarine to Japan, the formula was like this. The U.S. Navy provided the explanation on the safety of nuclear reactor aboard the ship, and the Japanese Atomic Energy Commission endorsed this explanation by the U.S. Navy. But since the Fukushima nuclear disaster, this Japan Atomic Energy Commission is now losing its credibility. So I am personally afraid of, the opposition camp in Japan might be encouraged by the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and they will rebound its rally against the visits by U.S. nuclear-powered vessels, nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. Of course, those U.S. nuclear-powered vessels are playing critical role in the regional security and stability. So so this might be a negative impact of the nuclear disaster. And another point is, before the nuclear disaster, there was some discussion in Japan about the feasibility of introduction of Japanese-owned nuclear-powered attack submarine, because one of the primary regional security concerns is the Chinese submarine buildup, and Japanese Navy circle, Navy people considered the use, the desirability of introduction of SSN into Japanese maritime self-defense force. But because of the nuclear disaster, I think this argument is now gone for at least 5 or 10 years. So in conclusion, I think the nuclear disaster relief is now become a very important agenda for not only for U.S. and Japan, but also for the regional militaries. Just like the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was a turning point for the regional militaries, and they, focused on the natural disaster relief operation as one of the confidence-building measures. I think regional militaries can now work on the, nuclear disaster relief as well. And even in North Korea, they have concern about their nuclear reactor. So I hope the nuclear disaster relief cooperation can be another regional confidence-building measure. And another point is, since the U.S. nuclear powered vessels are a critical part of the regional security and stability, regional countries need to cooperate to maintain the assured access by the U.S. military, U.S. Navy forces into the regional ports, especially Japanese ports and Korean ports like Busan. And since the tension in the South China Sea is now rising, I hope the U.S. Navy forces will continue to visit the South China Sea countries. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kotani has put two big issues on the table. One was that the operational response, effective response by the U.S. and Japanese forces is now actually being institutionalized in terms of the alliance at the 22 June 2+2 meeting, where they'll talk about a permanent U.S.-Japan nuclear disaster response force. It begs the question about regional and international responses, though, how these will work together, how we can augment the international machinery. And then he's also raised the question that military forces, despite the fact that an actor like naval reactors, which represents all of the nuclear expertise within the U.S. nuclear navy, played a key role in responding to this crisis. Nuclear energy in the military is still a question mark, whether it's the U.S. forces and port visits or whether it's Japanese considering a longer range submarine in its future, which would be a nuclear powered. Zach, let's go to you next.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. General Yamaguchi already very capably described the cooperation between the SDF and U.S. forces immediately following disaster. So I'd like to focus on some of the challenges that are presented to the U.S. and Japan following disaster, and also to some of the opportunities that may open up as because of it. First, I'd like to say that the alliance hasn't fundamentally changed in nature since the disaster. The regional dynamics are still very much the same, and the U.S. and Japan still share quite a lot of interests, namely engaging North Korea over its nuclear weapons program, engaging China, or re-emerging China. We still have interests in development in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and securing sea lanes, commerce in a lot of the volatile areas in East Asia. So the alliance is going to continue forward, I think, as it has in the past. And as Secretary Gates mentioned recently, this is an opportunity actually for the U.S. and Japan to work even more closely now than before. I'd also like to say that it's very difficult in some senses to separate the nuclear disaster from the other components of the disaster, namely the tsunami. Since we're here at the Asan conference here discussing nuclear issues, I'll try to do it to the degree possible, but in some senses, especially when looking at the economic impacts, it's tough to divorce those two. But I think just to touch quickly on the military response, I think this was an excellent demonstration of the interoperability between the SDF and U.S. forces. General Yamaguchi mentioned the USS Reagan, the fact that the United States was able to deploy assets very quickly to help out those who are suffering in northern Japan. So I think that this shows that the investment that the United States and Japan has made over the past several decades has really made an impact and is starting to pay off, because it's invaluable to be able to have that kind of reaction time in a time of need. I think the challenges going forward are substantial, particularly when Japan is as reliant on nuclear power as it is. Japan gets about 30% of its power from the nuclear industry. They had a plan, of course, to increase to about 50% of their power generation by 2030. That plan was scrapped following the disaster. And now Japan has to look where it's going to get its energy to replace that which will not be coming, it seems, from the nuclear industry. Until renewable energy becomes cost-effective and becomes a realistic option, the number one issue here, I think, is going to be for Japan to secure additional fossil fuels. It's already the largest importer of coal, the largest importer of liquefied natural gas, second largest importer of oil. These numbers, I think, are going to increase. The downside, of course, is that it's going to introduce potential supply disruptions, price spikes, everything else that comes along with fossil fuels. As others have mentioned, there was an excellent panel yesterday on the Japan's nuclear program following Fukushima. But there's, for instance, there are 19 of the 54 nuclear power plants are in operation now. Many now undergoing maintenance and undergoing safety upgrades. While I think Japan will still be moving forward with nuclear power in the future, at the moment, until there's confidence in it and confidence in the system, it's going to be very difficult. And so I think that's going to push Japan toward fossil fuels, at least for the short term. I don't know how long that's going to be, but that's I think the intermediary step until we can move on to another stage. TEPCO has even estimated that the additional costs for replacing the power lost by Fukushima be over $12 billion, and so we're not talking about trivial amounts of money here. Also, if you're looking at the estimates for recovery from the disaster writ large, anywhere from $200 to $300 billion, this, on top of the surging national debt that Japan faces, is a formidable challenge. Ultimately, I think we should be very optimistic. I think Japan can certainly rebound from this, but the addition of this disaster certainly was not helpful, given already the pre-existing economic issues. Another issue besides the energy, though, is the defense posture. How is Japan going to reorient its defense posture based on the outcomes of the disaster? It's possible that they might focus more on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. If you look back at the National Defense Program guidelines Japan put out at the end of last year, you see that it was very externally focused on expanding missile defense capabilities, on protecting Southwest islands, other issues. Perhaps now we might see a shift. There's going to seriously be some resource constraints on how Japan spends its defense dollars, and so I think that if you see a reorienting of the policy there, that's going to affect how the U.S.-Japan alliance goes forward on security issues. The good news, though, I think, is that this actually presents quite a few opportunities for the U.S. and Japan to work together to solve some of these problems. Specifically looking at the nuclear disaster, one area where the U.S. and Japan might collaborate is on intelligence gathering, on surveillance and reconnaissance, ISR assets. We had a UAV fly over the stricken power plant shortly after the disaster to gather imagery and to help inform decision-making process. And I think that these types of assets could be very helpful going forward. They're flexible as well, so they can be used in a wide number of scenarios. The U.S. also sent its U-2 spy planes that were used formerly to spy on Soviet missile sites, to move them from Okinawa up to Japan, to also to northern Japan to help out with the response to the nuclear disaster. So these kinds of things can, I think, be beneficial going forward. It's an area of possible collaboration between the U.S. and Japan. When it comes to the energy industry, the Fukushima plants, designed in the 1960s, built in the 1970s, relied on older technology. If you go back to statements recently by Secretary Chu of the Department of Energy, was really stressing the importance of developing new technology nuclear power plants. this is another area where the U.S. and Japan can collaborate going forward. The goal obviously has to be to create the safest plants possible. As we mentioned, Japan is heavily reliant upon nuclear power, and even if that takes a downturn in the short term, I think in the long term that's going to be a stable portion of their energy development, and so this is going to be a fruitful area, I think, of collaboration. Finally, and I think Dr. Braun may be able to speak to this as well, but and Patrick mentioned in his opening comments, but the regulation of Japan's nuclear industry, obviously another area where the U.S. and Japan can collaborate going forward. I understand that Japan's going to announce that it's going to have a fully independent regulatory agency. It's obviously a very good step. The key now then is to implement that and to make it successfully independent so that the Japanese public notice can gain confidence in the regulatory process in order to move forward from here. So several challenges lie ahead, but I think on the upside it does present quite a few opportunities for collaboration.
Zach, thank you very much for that list. I'd pick out the big question of if Japan does significantly alter its energy strategy to rely less on nuclear energy. At the same time, you've got a big economy like German economy threatening to now end all nuclear power for civil use by 2021. What kind of impact does that have on the global energy market, on the economy? The issue of military responses, not just UAVs and spy planes, but also the question of whether space-based assets can detect radiation is a key question right now in Japanese scientific and governmental circles that we're looking at. And then indeed regulation, I'm sure, is one that Hayam is going to talk about, among others. So please, Dr. Braun.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to talk about technical, regulatory, and institutional issues that have to do with the results of the accident. Of course, there are so many issues, it's impossible to cover everything. And I'll just take a pot shot at some issues that I think are of importance. First of all, I think the most important lesson that we learn again is that good, safe operation is also good economics. Safety is important on its own in an absolute term, but good safety is also good economics. This is a lesson that's known very well in the United States. I think it's been strengthened again in what we saw when there was an issue of whether to flood the plant and lose its future economic value or not to flood it. This decision has been delayed for some time. However, look at the consequences. Safe operation throughout the life of the plant has got enormous economic value, and it should be maintained. There are very interesting issues that have to do with third-party liability, trans-border contamination, and who's responsible for that. What do you do with third-party liability when you have an exceptional act of God? Who's responsible for that? It's beyond any accident that moved the entire Earth 10 centimeters in its orbit to a different orbit. Definitely it's not something that is beyond design basis accident. It's something of completely exceptional nature. So who will take care of it? There are multiple technical evaluations that need to be done, and I will not try to preempt the regulatory agencies, which will of course spend years trying to pore over exactly what happened and what should be done to counter what has happened in future operation of nuclear plants. Among the issues that I'd just like to pick at the moment, I'll pick on three particular issues. One is the call now to prevent common mode accidents by building each reactor on a separate site. This idea has been proposed in several places, and if you know the difficulty of opening a nuclear site, which is the major impediment to the expansion of nuclear power anywhere, this idea, even though it may have some remote technical merit, has got such institutional barriers to it that it's practically impractical. You just cannot do it. We'll have to live with multiple units on site, particularly in a crowded area like Japan, where most of the population lives on the periphery rather than the center of the country, and we'll have to try and manage safe operation or multiple unit stations. Another issue that came about on a technical side is preventing station blackout. This is a major technical issue. Anyone who knows anything about nuclear plant safety knows that a station blackout is a disaster situation if it could happen, and preventing it is a necessity, is absolute necessity in order to allow safe operation. Frankly, there are many ways of taking care of this problem. It's not that this is an unknown problem that people don't know how to solve it. It's quite known. Among the possible methods are multiple connection to the electric grid, not just one or two connection. And we saw this thing in Japan, where the Onagawa station still managed to maintain outside connection to the grid and therefore avoided station blackout, whereas Fukushima Daiichi station unfortunately lost all outside power to the grid with serious consequences. Second approach is to put diesel generators in a secure facility up, not in the basement of the building, but in a separate, well-secured, Class 1 safety building, standalone, with adequate fuel supply. Again, this is nothing major. It's simply good engineering that needs to be done in order to do this. Long-life batteries are another third option that could be done. And in that context, the unseeming argument in the United States as to whether 4-hour batteries are enough, or 6-hour batteries, or maybe it's 8 hours, or maybe 16 hours, it's really unseeming. Evidently, you need the longest life possible batteries in order to maintain the avoidance of station blackout for the longest time possible. Finally, there's of course the possibility of putting a gas turbine on plant. That has been done in the Paluel station in France and in several other power stations, where in addition to everything else, there's also a gas turbine with its own fuel supply on site that could provide on-site power if all off-site power is lost. Evidently, any combination of this could be appropriate in each station, and each situation should be evaluated on its own. Of course, it will cost a lot of money, but when you consider the possibility or the consequences of not having this, when you're talking about plant lifetime of 60 to 80 years, which take about 30 years to recover the capital cost, and after that, it's essentially a license to print money for about 50 years. You don't want to danger this or to endanger it, but not putting the maximum possible protection measures against your system. The concept of investment protection is something that's ingrained in electric utilities and should be put to work in terms of station blackout prevention. Another issue that came out of the accident is the issue of spent fuel management. Evidently, keeping a lot of fuel in a spent fuel pool, let alone on the operating floor of the reactor, is not a very good idea. There will be a need to move from wet storage, particularly on the operating floor, into dry storage on-site, and eventually to dry storage off-site. This is not a simple matter as it says, but there are technical solutions to do so. In this context, let me mention something that may be appropriate for the Northeast Asia region. As we know right now, Rokashimura Station in Japan has not, the reprocessing plant and energy center have not been completed, and given the technical difficulty of TEPCO and other Japanese utilities in continuing funding the completion operation of the Rokashimura Reprocessing and Recycling Center, it may be possible to think again about reviving an old idea that has been around for some time and been investigated many times before, of converting Rokashimura into a regional energy center for spent fuel storage or reprocessing in Northeast Asia. There are other utilities in Northeast Asia, KHNP, Taipower, that have got a lot of money, but they have a problem of what to do with spent fuel. Rokashimura Center has a problem of not having in the future adequate enough money to fund its completion and its operation. I know that the Japanese government is also interested in resolving in a satisfactory and quality assurance good way the problem of spent fuel storage in all of East Asia region, let alone in Japan proper. Given the situation, it might make sense to combine the needs and the availabilities of Japan on the one hand and other countries in Northeast Asia on the other hand, and allow other countries to contribute their resources for the completion and safe operation of the Rokashimura Center in Japan, in exchange for allowing them to store the spent fuel and eventually to reprocess it in the Rokashimura Center as an international first demonstration of regional spent fuel storage under Japanese, regional and IAEA supervision. That would be a great demonstration of the concept of regional energy center that has been proposed by the IAEA. And as you recall, the issue of spent fuel storage was identified by the IAEA as the first and most important aspect of which regional energy center should address. That could be an excellent opportunity of handling this particular situation. I'd like to go now to regulatory issues. There are many regulatory issues that should be covered, and of course I cannot cover all of them, but let me cover two issues. The first is operating all plants to a standard, internationally acceptable set of safety standards. It's possible now to devise a set of regulatory safety aspect and regulations which should be applied across the board uniformly in all countries right now. This could be done by the IAEA and could provide another role for the IAEA, which unfortunately seemed not to have an adequate role in regards to the Fukushima accident. There will be a need eventually for an international regulatory agency that will supervise the continuing operation of national regulatory agencies operating to the same set of safety standards across the board, so that we won't have a case where one country operates nuclear power plants to one set of safety standards and another country operates nuclear plants to a different set of nuclear standards. So really the role of harmonizing safety standards and supervising the regulatory operation of different regulatory agencies is a new mission for the IAEA in the future. However, that does not absolve the utilities from their own responsibility, and in that respect, in the United States there has been an excellent demonstration of the INPO process of utility self-help and self-responsibility for the safe operation of all the power plants. The example of INPO was evolved into the international form of INPO, WANO, that came out of the Chernobyl accident. Unfortunately, not all nuclear power countries in the world subscribe to the operation of the WANO in the same level of detail as other countries. In particular, France and Japan have been less active in the operation of WANO than other countries. I think one of the lessons that we learn here is the need to operate this utility self-help organization with active participation of all nuclear electric utilities in the world without exception. An important aspect of the safe operation that has to do with INPO and eventually with WANO is the issue of looking at the worst performers. There's always one or two nuclear plants that are the worst performers, and it seemed to me that it may be the point now of requiring or walking through the INPO and the WANO process of identifying the worst performers, at least in private. Secondly, possibly to the national regulatory agencies where appropriate. And thirdly, maybe eventually to publish the names of the worst utilities. The process of naming and shaming has got enormous value in terms of modifying behavior, and this should be considered in its most appropriate way in different regions and in different countries. And this issue should be taught again. In that context, another thing that should be done is the bringing about the greater participation of the insurance agencies in the running and safe operation of nuclear power plants. As you know, each utility has got to pay a premium to the insurance company, which is in the United States part of the Price-Anderson system, and all other countries have got similar mechanism to guarantee the insurance of the operating plants. Evidently, plants that ranked badly on the INPO or the WANO operating scale seem to be operating less well than other utilities. Therefore, they represent greater insurance risk, and therefore the premiums to the insurance company should reflect the situation. Therefore, tying utility insurance premium to utility plant performance might be a good idea whose time had come, in that you need to convince utilities to improve the power plant performance, not just to the process of naming and shaming, but to the process of putting financial penalty on bad performance. The combination of naming and shaming and penalty for bad performance is something that will clearly get utility attention in the future. And that's something that's worth thinking about. I'd like to transfer now to the last item I have on my mind, and that's the fact that the nature of the global nuclear industry is changing as a result of the Fukushima accident. In the West, evidently, there is a push for extra super safe nuclear power plants, what I would call generation 3 plus. And evidently those plants, which will be more expensive, there will be fewer of them that will be built, and therefore the future expansion of nuclear power in the West will be somewhat more limited. On the other hand, the nuclear programs in Eastern countries, in China, in India, in Vietnam, in Korea, will continue apace with safe enough plants, based on generation 3 plants, 3 plus with some minor enhancement, and the major expansion of global nuclear power will occur in the East with relatively well-managed and well-safe nuclear plants. Those plants will be the basis for nuclear export for the rest of the world, whereas in the West there will be a smaller dependence of nuclear power plants and smaller construction of new, more expensive nuclear power plants. What we will see is probably a bifurcation of nuclear power in the world between what happens in the East on the one hand and what happens in the West on the other hand. This is neither good nor bad. As my old boss used to say, it is just so. The leverage of the West in modifying or in setting the nuclear agenda will of course decline, but this is the way of the world. There's nothing we could do about it. Let me though say in the end that the fundamentals of nuclear power remain the same. Nuclear power still represents the only technology for large-scale baseload power application that doesn't emit no greenhouse gas emissions. It's required for diversity of energy resources. It's required for security of supply. When operated well, it's required for economics and for good performance. And we can expect eventually, though the pendulum has swung in one direction right now, with the eventual stabilization, understanding what happened in Fukushima, and with continued safe operation of the existing nuclear plants fleet in the world, for the pendulum to swing back to some more neutral position. If we operate future power plants in a safe mode, the future will take care of itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some excellent points there. We're going to, if I can just retrack a couple of these. One of them reminds me of a discussion we just had with Goshi Hosono, the point man on nuclear issues for the Prime Minister in Japan, where he is right now in Europe trying to work with the IAEA, trying to take the tragedy and see if we can't effectively build better machinery, maybe along the lines you mentioned in terms of IAEA regulation. At the same time, he and the Prime Minister and others in Japan are worried about Japan losing the right of reprocessing. So your concept of a regional scheme, on the one hand, is a live idea. It's a worthy idea. It's also one that potentially treads on sovereignty issues that is a concern to any country, in this case Japan. The issue that you raise about bringing in expertise from insurance companies to international expertise seems to me very important. After 3 Mile Island, the United States brought together some of the best scientific minds to independently investigate the lessons learned. I think Japan is thinking along these lines, but clearly they need to think very broadly as they look for that expertise. Your basic point, though, about good safety equals good economics is seemingly indisputable, and yet you've also pointed out why, on the one hand, some of it through good engineering is readily done, could be done. On the other hand, some of it is still very difficult. And that's why we're here, to talk and think about these ideas. I see a hand back here. It looks like Brad Glosserman. Wait for the microphone, and let's join the discussion.
Pacific Forum, CSIS. Quick questions. One, not possibilities, but is there evidence that the disaster shaped public perceptions of the SDF in Japan? Is there evidence, again, not possibilities, that it shaped the Okinawa Futenma relocation facility dynamic? And finally, is there evidence, or what is all of you take on the possibility, the fear that Japan is going to be much more inward-looking after this and less engaged regionally, et cetera, for focusing on rebuilding?
Brad, all good questions. I mean, this is 3 months after the disaster, and already we've got a conventional wisdom that the SDF, U.S. forces as well, are now more widely respected, that Japan may be looking more inward as well, if only for economic reasons, in terms of dealing with this recovery in the short to medium term. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. The question is whether there's hard empirical evidence, and I think that will have to be borne out over time to see the longer-term impact. I will note that at the National Defense University last week, at the graduation, for the first time in scores of years, they had a crasher who came in. It was Ambassador Ichiro Fujisaki, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, and he wanted to make a very short but very important intervention to especially the military officers, men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces, to say, thank you, this has dramatically shaped his own view. Again, anecdotal, it's a good thing for an ambassador to do. It was a very humble and gracious thing for him to do. But I wonder if we can, maybe Noboru Yamaguchi can talk about some of the evidence he's seen.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I found at the beginning of the crisis was Okinawa media. I mean, some of the Okinawa newspaper started saying that it is not fair to legitimate U.S. presence in Japan by using the experience in Tohoku. That was because Marines were doing a fine job, and Okinawa media may have fear of more popular sort of response from Okinawan people. That was one side. Okinawan media, I thought, was scared about the Okinawan people changing their attitude more pro-American forces. That's why they said it is not fair to use this experience to legitimate the U.S. presence. And in addition, inward-looking. We used to be very much inward-looking, maybe 1 year or 2 years ago. But now, no. Because of the help from the international community, we have no choice to pay it back to the international community. So we cannot be inward-looking. For me, this is a good opportunity to change our attitude towards more outward-looking.
Of course, we have a very internationalist panel, so that's a very difficult question to ask. This to be self-critical. Go ahead.
I think we should remember also the heroism of the plant operators that were willing to stay in the plant under difficult conditions and absorb possible high radiation doses, more than normal operation. And their role should be honored in addition to the role of the military. By the way, this is not unique to Japan. Similar situation like this occurred in Chernobyl, where helicopter pilots flew over the reactor and dropped lead and whatever, despite the high radiation dose they absorbed. And again, it was a case of the armed forces that rose to help a difficult technical problem in a nuclear plant. Those were called in Russia the liquidators, and their acts of heroism equal those that we saw in Fukushima. We should not forget them.
Absolutely. We have time is short. Yes, sir. A microphone is coming to you. It turns on in a second. I don't know the system.
Martin Fackler with the New York Times. I'm wondering about the interoperability of the U.S. and Japanese forces. And I'm wondering, first off, what problems appeared during 3/11 that could be resolved? And second off, what sort of advancements or changes? And I have in mind, for example, when I was talking with the commander of the 31st MU, he was saying that the Japanese were very reluctant to even do drills on amphibious landing and these sorts of things. And I wonder if, given the role of the Marine Corps and the USS Essex and these things that, off of Iwate, if these sorts of operations may become more possible in the future.
Good question about Japanese self-defense forces and interoperability with U.S. forces to undertake a range of missions, from amphibious landings to dealing with the crises like this.
We might have been kind of hesitant to do amphibious landing exercise kinds of things maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15. But now we have been more and more accepting or more willing to have those exercises. Like the operations, the exercises helped by U.S. Marines in California. We send our kind of special operation forces or the landing forces to amphibious for amphibious training in California. So that is not the issue. But the more important, we need to do a lot of business, not the operational or frontline business, but rather the logistic deployment sort of the business. In that sense, this experience has made a lot for the both sides, U.S. and Japanese military, to cooperate in case of future possible contingency, or to prepare for possible contingencies in the future, for particularly logistic plans, which may apply to many kinds of plans operations for the possible operations.
Tetsuo-san, do you want to answer on that?
Yes, on the interoperation, actually the Chinese government offered the dispatch of a hospital ship, and actually we rejected it. And the Chinese Navy people, continue to ask me why, and the waters of Sanriku were very much, dangerous because there were, the debris underwater, and only the U.S. and Japan Navy ships can operate because they work every day. So under such a dangerous waters, only the allied navies could cooperate, and we needed to reject the offer from the Chinese hospital ship. So the daily cooperation is critical.
The problems with interoperability. I think the biggest problems that we saw back in Washington were questions of the timing and therefore emergency coordination. This was the first week in particular as the meltdown started, and I think you had a dual problem here. On the one hand, you had the TEPCO and the operators who were holding most of the information and also lacking information because of the difficulty, because of power outages, because of difficulties of getting to see it. And therefore, you had a government that was still getting its own sea legs in terms of trying to effectively manage a government without having a National Security Council type structure, without having the kind of emergency management that we have in the U.S., and slowly trying to get a grip on that. That's why someone like Goshi Hosono coming over to the Kante, to the Prime Minister's office, was important, because in Adano-san, important to force the industry, which was holding the information, to be forthcoming. That led to some of the disputes. Some of the public disputes about evacuation zones, for instance, between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Japan, are more complex than they seem in the headlines, and your paper has done some good reporting on this. But the point is that Japan has to think about evacuating hundreds of thousands of people. When the Americans announced an evacuation zone well out of Tokyo, they had to think about dozens of people. Very different scale when you're thinking about evacuation zones, for instance. So in general, I think the interoperability was strong. And where you had other issues like the George Washington that Tetsuo-san hit on earlier, you're dealing with political differences more than real military interoperability. I think this is basically a plus for moving ahead with interoperability, but there are other questions that remain, including things that Zach Osford mentioned, the National Defense Program guidelines that were issued in December of last year, very much talked about reorienting Japanese self-defense forces toward a mission of the Ryukyu Island chain, including amphibious operations potentially. These Marines that essentially the U.S. is training at Camp Pendleton is oriented toward that mission. Will that slow down as a result of just the sheer costs of money that's needed in the short term to the recovery of the Sendai and Tohoku area? Who knows? Those are some of the questions that will be dramatically on the agenda of the 2+2 when I think you'll hear Secretary Gates and his departure meeting with the Japanese, along with Secretary Clinton, highlight the importance of interoperability and the potential, whether it's the humanitarian assistance disaster relief mission, which we'll hear a lot about, but also in future other maritime missions, which is a little murkier, more difficult set of issues because it brings into question about territorial disputes that Koreans know a lot about, Chinese and every country in the region has a different view on. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank this terrific panel. I want to thank all of you for your time. Thank you so much.
We will now have a quick coffee break. The next session will start in 15 minutes. There will be a networking lunch session on our lunchtime.